The warehouse smelled of cardboard and refrigerant air, at the kind of cold that came from loading docks left open too long. Sable Kirkwood was 19 years old, and she checked her balance the way some people check the weather, automatically, without hoping for much. $17.85. What was left on a prepaid guest of the week. Confirm, the number sitting steady in her head, before she'd even pulled out her phone to confirm it. The concrete under her sneakers was hard, and cold enough to climb up through the soles, a chill she'd stopped noticing around hour 3 of every shift. Somewhere down the line, a conveyor belt clattered along in its steady rhythm, boxes sliding and settling, before she'd even turned to look at the stack forming at the end of it. In her coat pocket, her thumb found shape of a brass sextant pin, its clasp long broken. The only piece of her grandfather's things that had survived the estate sale of his apartment. Walt had raised her after her parents died, had spent his last years and most of what he had keeping them both fed and housed, right up until 5 weeks ago. People starting through you, she thought, sliding another case of canned goods onto the belt, the moment they decide you've got nothing left to offer. A few yards away, approving $380 in someone else's overtime request, without so much as glancing in her direction. Her phone buzzed against her hip. A law office, outposted, Haute, Traverse City, the voice on the other end explained. Calling about something called the Kirkwood estate matter, going to be at Juxor. There was a structure, the woman said, on the northern shoreline that needed to be addressed. She was already thinking of Walt cutting his heart pills in half to stretch the bottle another month, saving pennies on medication that kept him alive. What? Right, exactly. Had a man like that ever and printer toner? Cold enough on the stone floors that Sable could feel it rising through the soles of her shoes. Greed, the munting. She sat with her hands folded in her lap because there was nothing else for them to do. Desmond Atterberg sat across the table, his cufflinks catching the light every time he reached for another page, a trace of expensive cologne cutting through the coffee smell whenever he leaned forward. And he carried himself like a man reviewing a transaction he'd already won. The numbers came first. 575 to her grandfather. Went to Desmond, clean and uncontested. Clean and uncontested. Then came Sable's inheritance, a deed and nothing else. Averlight, a decommissioned lighthouse on a spit of land north of town, condemned by the Coast Guard 11 years earlier, its lens stripped out and sold off long before that. Desmond exhaled once that didn't need sound to land, amused. The laughed that didn't need sound, he said, sliding his own paperwork into a leather folio with a soft, expensive click. Poetic, really, something abandoned, left to someone nobody was really watching either. Sable said nothing. Silence, she had learned, cost her nothing and gave him less to work with. The lawyer, almost as an afterthought, slid a small tin cigar box across the table. Found sat an iron skeleton key and a torn insurance attached. Inside sat an ironed and manifest, the paper gone brittle and yellow, dated 1928. Desmond didn't glance at it. Already moving in heroines, he'd ever thought worth a second look already secured. A second, sad, outside, alone in the parking lot. Is the margin, in her grandfather's with still legible, were 10 words. Lamp, room floor, were 10 words. Third board from the ladder. Ask what was never turned in. She had never once, 19 years, set foot inside that lighthouse. But she had fired with just next to get, 90 kos left to get her there. 94 miles up the coast. The road narrowed until it was just Sable and the dark water beside her. She slept once, in a rest stop outside Charlevoix, seat reclined only halfway, because a motel would have cost $42 she needed for gas instead. She smelled the lighthouse before she'd even parked. It had been left water and rusted iron for over a decade. The particular smell alone with the weather for a decade. The wind coming off Lake Michigan cut sharper and colder than anything she'd felt inland, straight through her jacket the moment she stepped out of the car. Somewhere above her, a loose chain slapped against the tower in an uneven rhythm, off by half a beat. The each toe handle was pitted with rust under her fingers, flaking away at her touch. For only then did she let herself look up at the tower itself. The lantern room, the spiral staircase. A whole section of the spiral staircase had collapsed somewhere near the middle. Gulls had built nests along the catwalk where the light used to turn. It was worse than anything the county's surplus listing photos had shown. She stood at the base of the stairs for a long moment, weighing the 94 miles behind her against a staircase that looked like it might not hold her weight at all. For a moment, she considered turning, had never back. In 19 years of her watching him, walked away from a repair before testing every rung of it himself, so she tested the stairs and stepped. Climbing toward the lamp room, weight shifted slow before she trusted the next step, climbing toward the lamp room. She heard something the wind alone couldn't account for. From somewhere beneath the floor, above her, evenly spaced, something over, like something breathing. She reached the top and counted the floorboards out from the base of the ladder. Third one was shorter, by decades edge cut clean rather than warped by decades of weather. The iron skeleton key in her pocket for something meant to open a nightstand drawer. The floor gave up its secret one splinter at a time. She found a crowbar coiled in a length of rope near the base of the tower and used it to work loose the cut board and the ones beside it, her hands blistering raw where the tool bit back against her grip. 3.5 hours. What she uncovered, finally, scraping away the last room's stone base, its edges pitted but unmistakable. That was the first stage, the anomaly, confirmed. Beneath decades of gull droppings and dust, a keyhole sat under a rusted latch. She didn't need to guess what would fit it. The key turned. The hatch didn't move at all, rusted solid in for 2 attempts, and she wedged the crowbar beneath the rim on the third try, and the hinges screamed as they finally gave way beneath her. Mineral cold air rode her. Stale, mineraled air rose up first, the smell of stone that had gone unbothered for decades. Then silence total and sudden, where the groaning had been only moments before. Then cold pressed against her face, sharper than the wind outside had managed all night. Only then did she lower her flashlight and let it show her what her other senses had already promised. A strong room, narrow, the size of a small delivery van, cut into stone, and lined along one wall with wooden crates, their stenciled marking nearest crepe and soft with age, and the wood gave way easily, tired of holding on. Inside, gold ingots, 19 of them, each stamped with a maritime insurance seal she didn't recognize. She did not gasp. Twice, the way she'd counted every number in her life since Walt died. A second, older document explained what her hands were holding. In November of 1928, the freighter SS Averill Constance had gone down in a gale off the point, and her great-grandfather, the Lighthouse's keeper, at the time, had quietly recovered part of the insured cargo from the wreckage, using his own skiff. But the insurance company had already paid the shipping firm in full before the recovery, which meant reporting it risked exposing that it had taken a quiet payment from the company to keep silent about how much cargo had actually washed ashore. So it had stayed here instead, beneath the crates, a letter her grandfather's handwriting, steady despite its age. It named Desmond's own father as the man who had once threatened to stay choir-room to the county, unless he was paid to stay quiet himself. It said, plainly, "You're the only one who ever climbed those stairs with me and asked why the light stopped turning. That's why it's yours." It instructed her to contact the Maritime Insurance Archive in Lansing before moving anything further, and pointed her toward a policy number listed on the manifest tied not to any estate, but to whoever legally held the lighthouse. MC 2231. She was still holding the letter when a truck engine on the gravel access road She had been inside for nearly 4 hours. No one, two had come anyway. Someone. The staircase groaned under a second set of footsteps before Desmond Achterberg came up her flashlight. Desmond Achterberg came up slower than she had, Penilst texting the collapsed Siegton with his flashlight beam sweeping the open beside it. He wasn't out of breath by the time he reached the catwalk. That was the detail she noticed first. A man who hadn't climbed anything in years. Nasinchi, arriving exactly when it mattered. A county surplus property agent rather than Sartingson, he said, easy, like they were finishing a conversation rather than starting one. He mentioned some girl had been asking about permits up here. Wasn't hard to guess who. The cold had settled into her hands hour ago and hadn't left. She said nothing. Desmond glanced toward the open hatch without stepping closer to it. There's transfer hasn't against the wind. Here's how this works, he said. The deed transfer hasn't cleared yet. Won't clear for another 8 days. Until it does, anything recovered on this site reverts to the estate's residual holdings. He let that sit a moment, which I manage. He told her she had until sunrise to hand over whatever she'd found, or he'd report unauthorized entry into a condemned Coast Guard seal it before she could prove she'd ever set structure. And arguing spent something set foot inside. She didn't argue. Arguing spent something she didn't have left tonight. Instead, she ran through what she actually held. The C number her grandfather's hand. A policy number she hadn't called in yet. A letter that told her exactly who to contact and why. And one thing Desmond had just said without meaning to. He'd known enough to send a friend to watch us pet house he'd called poetic and abandoned in front of a room full of witnesses just days ago. A man didn't do that for something he actually believed was worthless. Desmond smiled, the same controlled exhale from the law office behind it, and started backing toward the ladder. There's nothing up here worth losing sleep over, sweetheart, he said, and stood there a moment longer than he needed to, blocking it, before stepping back to make a call. Sable looked down at the manifest still folded in her hand. Then she looked up at the ladder he was blocking. Like it already belonged to him, when it never had. At 6 in the morning, the manifest gave her one more thing Desmond's golfing friend had never thought to look for. A direct line to the Maritime Insurance Archive in Lansing. Printed small along the bottom margin, untouched for 96 years. The archivist who answered and sounded who had spent a career than both of them, combined, unhurried, exact. Sable gave the number. MC2231, and waited while the woman pulled the record. The policy in 1928, untouched since. Recovery rights hadn't followed any estate's holdings. They followed the deed and had from start, attaching permanently to whoever legally held the lighthouse. As of this morning, and every morning before it that the manifest had sat unread in a cigar box, that was. The archivist offered to fax over a written confirmation. Sable asked her to read it aloud twice first, just to be certain she'd heard every word correctly. Desmond came back at dawn with 2 men from a salvage crew, already talking about clearing the site before any of them had reached the top of the stairs. Sable didn't argue with him. She handed him the printed confirmation instead. She watched him read it. She watched the exact moment his eyes reached the line that mattered. Recovery rights attached to current title holder of the property. And the same composed exhale from the law office caught somewhere in his throat and simply didn't come back out. His 2 men had already caught the other words on the page. Maritime backing toward the ladder. They looked at each other once, then started backing toward the particular retreat of men, cargo, out of illegal had agreed to. Neither the lice was poetic. Desmond didn't say anything. You said, not raising her voice. Sable did, she said, not needing to. Turns out you're only one in this family who never actually look. Turns out you were the only one in this family. The salvage crew would repeat that line, almost word for looked. Hugh, one of the salvage, to a reporter weeks later, once the State Archives inquiry made the local paper. Not because he owed Sable anything, it was the kind of thing that stuck with you. Desmond left without answering her. He didn't linger on who bolted the hatch shut behind him. The State Archives investigation, State of Bontaines, had only just opened. Naught was settled, yet. Not the claim, not the gold, not what would happen to everything still sitting in that strong room. But Sable climbed down the tower an hour later, the cigar box tucked under her arm. In between Senba pained, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she wasn't walking away from anything at all. She was walking toward it. 5 months later, the State Archives inquiry closed with a single confirming line. The recovered gold belonged entirely to titleholder of record. Desmond Achterberg did not attend the final hearing. By then, he was answering questions of his own. His father's investigator old payoff scheme had surfaced 1928 insurance file, and within weeks, Desmond was removed as trustee of any remaining family holdings. He left Port Averill before the following year was out. The Lighthouse didn't stay condemned. Sable, Sable, 20 now, had restored Averill Point Light, Maritime Museum and Trust, a small historical site with the beacon, 4 people on the payroll, including a part-time position for the cousin, who'd once slept on her grandfather's through the worst of it. She kept the brass sextant pin on a cord around her neck, not framed behind glass, somewhere for visitors to admire. She still wore it every day, the metal warm against her collarbone by the end of a shift. That mattered more to her than any inquiry ever could have. On a clear morning that spring, she stood at the top of the restored lantern ruin slow, even sweeps across the water, nothing like the colter, Neston, and the cold fluorescent hum of a warehouse at 4:10. No one in that family had ever asked what the lighthouse still held. Sable was the only one who had ever done dust. They asked what it cost to maintain, but those were rarely the same question at all.